What is the difference between Eastern and Western Europe? Why it matters? And what it means for the future of the European continent? These questions will be answered in this video. Of course, people are well aware that while at the end of the Second World War, Western Europe got liberated by the Americans, Eastern Europe had to spend nearly half a century under communism. However, what most people don't know is that the ideology of communism didn't just affect Eastern Europe, it also affected Western Europe, because although Western Europe was under the protective umbrella of the United States, there were individuals in Western European societies who actually wanted communism. From the year 1968 onwards, these individuals gradually infiltrated the institutions in Western Europe. They took over the education system, infiltrated the academic world, and basically started playing the long waiting game. Around the year 1990, Eastern Europe was finally free. In Western Europe around that time something else happened. The Marxists, whom by that time had basically taken over the institutions, had shifted their extreme left ideology from the domain of economics to the domain of culture. So their Marxist worldview, which makes a distinction between oppressing classes and oppressed classes, with the end goal of creating some utopia of equality of outcome, had been shifted towards cultural classes. Western civilization, the native peoples of Europe, being the oppressing class, and groups like Muslims and Africans being the new oppressed class. This led to the implementation of multiculturalism and to the rejection of the Western nation-state. Because what is the nation-state? Well, it basically is the only vehicle with which a nation can be free and exercise their right to self-determination. So a rejection of the nation-state basically implies a rejection of the national right to self-determination, and ultimately a rejection of the idea that a Western nation, such as the Dutch, have the right to be a free people. The Western Europeans stopped believing in the nation, which implies that they no longer believed in their own right to exist as a collection of free and independent peoples. So the Dutch no longer believed that in the future there should be this thing called Dutch people. And the Germans believed that at some point in the future there won't be any German people anymore, and that this is actually a good thing.
Ich bin der Auffassung, dass wir in 20, 30 Jahren gar keine ethnischen Mehrheiten mehr haben in unserer Stadt. Das ist das, was wir haben werden in der Zukunft, und ich sage Ihnen noch ganz deutlich, gerade hier in Richtung rechts, das ist gut so.
Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, things are very different. They fought against the same type of radical ideas for about half a century. And now that they're finally free, they dream about becoming a collection of free Western nations, because they view themselves as being an important part of Western civilization, of which the nation-state is a very important cornerstone. The Eastern Europeans thought, let's join our Western European friends in the European Union and become a strong family of Western nations, work together, defend our continent together, while each nation remains independent and free. Let's build a bright future together. However, slowly but surely, they discovered that something was wrong. They started noticing that there was something weird with their Western European friends. They noticed that the Germans actually didn't believe in Western civilization anymore, and that they weren't even willing to think and act in the interest of their own children and grandchildren. In 2015, Angela Merkel spoke the words "Wir schaffen das" and initiated a total makeover of the European continent. And when especially the Poles, the Hungarians, the Slovaks and the Czechs rejected this crazy plan, they quickly found themselves being under attack by their Western European friends.
Madam Commissioner, after 3 years, I don't want to hear the word dialogue anymore. We've been in dialogue with Mr. Orban for 10 years, and look at where we are now. It is impunity. Dialogue equals impunity by now. It is time for action. Now, I understand that Commissioner Jourová and Commissioner Reinders are ready to take action and to pursue the two pending procedures which are in court, but you're being blocked by Mrs. von der Leyen. Now, Mrs. von der Leyen is going to address this chamber on Wednesday, and I'm sure she's going to speak very moving words on the rule of law. But Mrs. von der Leyen, it's time to act, it's time to deliver, and I do not want to hear her say anymore, nobody is perfect, because impunity is encouraging other governments inside and outside Europe. How can we have moral authority, as Mrs. Sippel said, when we are giving support to the people in Belarus, when we are too chicken to tackle the governments of Poland and the government of Hungary and many others? Time to act now.
So here we see a woman who is Dutch and who belongs to a political party which is led by another woman who has her personal life deeply attached to a Palestinian terrorist movement and whose husband throughout the years has probably been involved with a number of terrorist attacks in Israel. But nonetheless, this woman feels very entitled to lecture those countries that do not have such Palestinian politicians in their government about what type of moral values they should live up to. Now, the Western European politicians of today are always talking about things like the rule of law, authoritarianism, democratic values, etc. in a way that for the Eastern Europeans doesn't make any sense, and which actually also doesn't make sense from an objective understanding of what Western civilization really is. For example, a leader elected by a sovereign nation is the opposite of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is what this woman is trying to do herself, trying to force another nation to do something that they do not want. The rule of law is something that belongs at a national level. The nation elects their representatives, and these representatives create laws that reflect the moral sensibilities of the nation. The idea that there is some kind of superseding supranational law which dictates from above to the peoples of Europe how they should live is illegitimate. Firstly, because the meaning of an independent and sovereign nation is to be free from exactly this type of imperialistic, externally enforced rules. And secondly, because people all around Europe voted against the establishment of such a supranational law. So this supranational law that this woman and others are talking about is something that has zero democratic legitimacy and is therefore authoritarian by its very nature. So while someone who belongs to the political elite from Western Europe attacks Poland and Hungary based on these allegations which result from an incorrect understanding of these principles, a politician from Eastern Europe views it in the following manner.
The fact that there are still nations that think in terms of nation, sovereignty, patriotism, religion, tradition of family, it's something so unbelievable for people like Timmermans, Juncker, Verhofstadt, that they just can't believe their eyes and ears when they hear it. It's a little bit like, I don't really like these comparisons between EU and Soviet Union, but it's a little bit like in the time of Khrushchev, and when you didn't believe in communism, you were sent to psychiatric hospital because it's obviously that you have to be psychologically ill if you don't believe that communism is the end state of history. So in the same way, in Western Europe, they probably believe that this sort of multicultural, progressivist society is the end state of history, and whoever doesn't believe is some sort of backwarded, psychologically ill person.
The fundamental disagreement between Eastern Europe and Western Europe is basically a clash between Western civilization, represented by Eastern Europe, and ideological forces that seek to destroy Western civilization, represented by Western Europe, or at least by the Western European political elite. Now, of course, at this moment I can hear some of the people who are watching this video thinking, nah, this is an exaggeration. Why do you think that Eastern Europeans are moving to Western Europe to work there? Well, that is a good and important point. But that is actually despite of all of this. The fact that people can have more economic prosperity in Western Europe than they can in Eastern Europe is the result of the fact that Western Europe had a head start of half a century to build up their economy after the Second World War under the umbrella of the United States, while Eastern Europe was still living under communism. So of course, economically speaking, the quality of life is still better in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe. But that brings us to the final question put forward in the beginning of this video. The difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. What does this mean for the future? My prediction is the following, and I'm sure that what I'm going to say is something that many people have never heard before. But I'm sure that as the situation develops during the next decade, my prediction will turn out to be correct. The future of Western civilization on this European continent will be located in Eastern Europe. Europe. In a decade or so, Western Europe will have become unlivable. The demographic changes caused by multiculturalism and the migration of non-Westerners into Western Europe will have changed Western Europe so fundamentally that it is no longer really a part of Western civilization. Around that time, also something else will have happened. Eastern European economies will have improved to such an extent that you can actually live in relative prosperity there. By that time, many of the Eastern Europeans that have been working in Western Europe will actually have returned to their own countries. In addition, around that time, many Western Europeans will want to move to Eastern Europe. Perhaps you still can't make as much money as you can in Western Europe today, but since the cost of living is slightly lower and you can actually have your children grow up safely with a good education system that doesn't brainwash your children with left-wing and Islamist ideologies, it will be more attractive to live in Poland than it will be to live in the Netherlands. My prediction is that the Visegrad 4 nations will turn out to become the heart of Europe and the center of Western civilization on this European continent. The world is always changing. Paris was once the great city of love. Places in Europe that people around the world have heard about and want to visit will turn into places that people want to avoid. This is why the difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe is important. The center of Western civilization on the European continent will shift from the western part to the eastern part. Thanks for watching this video. I wish you a nice day.